Any ethnomusicologists here? Anyone? Let's see. I'm the only one. Great. Well, I'm not going to be offending you. So ethnomusicologists practically disagree about everything, including this definition. But there are two things that most ethnomusicologists will agree on. The first one is that ethnomusicologists follow their ears for a living. So they go where their ears lead them, and that's where they find the music that they're interested in. And from there, they start understanding this culture, they start learning about these people, and they go back home and they write about it, and they teach at universities. And the second one is that they believe that when you go somewhere and you learn about somebody's music, you start understanding these people better. And when you understand them better, you start empathizing with them, and you can also tell other people about that. And if you're in this line of business, you see it happen over and over again. People that get inspired by certain music, go somewhere, study the music, and from there they start seeing these people differently, they start seeing themselves differently, and transformative experiences happen that way. So I don't teach at a university, but I help other people follow their ears. I help other people find out about music from other cultures, learn about them, and guide them through the experience of what happens to them when they see this music differently, when they learn that music. So I'm working in a project called the Nile Project, and you might be wondering, what is an ethnomusicologist doing with a very complex water problem like the Nile? So the story started a long time ago. I'm from Cairo, Egypt, so I have something to do with the Nile. But 4 years ago, if you had asked me that question, I wouldn't have known where to start. I was doing something completely different from working on the Nile. And I discovered the relevance of the Nile to me when I discovered the relevance of my work to the Nile. So we'll start from the beginning. I grew up in Cairo. I saw the belly dancer that Shlomo was talking about, and I got inspired, and I said, I'm going to study gypsies for a living. So when I got to college, I started studying the idea of the Indian origin of the gypsies. The gypsies were thought to come from Egypt. That's why they're called gypsies. And in about 1800, a German linguist discovered that the gypsies in Europe speak a language that's similar to the gypsies in India. And people started seeing all the relationships that were happening, and these people turned out that they had migrated about 1,000 years ago from India into the Middle East and to Europe. So I was studying something very specific. I was studying how the world music industry took the story of the gypsies' migration from India to Europe and made a musical product out of it. And how this product helped people understand what the gypsies are, or help further exoticize these gypsies because they come from India. No wonder they're so strange from the people living in Europe. And through that process, I started understanding how these cultural narratives that cross many geographies can be really powerful tools in increasing cultural curiosity, in helping people start thinking differently about people that live right around them. So I finished college, and I started a music school in San Francisco that's called Zambalita. Zambalita is a strange Egyptian word that doesn't exist in other languages. And it's basically a spontaneous cacophony. So we're sitting here. You hear some noise outside. You don't know if it's a fight or if it's a party. You see a crowd growing. So you run outside, and when you run outside, you're curious to see what's happening, so you go from the periphery of that crowd into the center to figure out what's happening. You find your friend fighting, so you start fighting with your friend, or you find all your friends playing music, and you're like, oh, this is a good party. I'm not going to come back in. I'm going to stay outside. And that cacophony keeps growing the more people are curious about it. So it has this viral effect. So it doesn't matter if it's a fight or if it's a party. What matters is that it has this viral effect. It reached that tipping point that gets people becoming more curious about it. And through that whole process, a lot of people that were spectators, that were at the periphery, start becoming performers. So it was a really interesting model for cultural participation, for engagement in the arts, and I thought that would be a nice name for the school. So we had lots of parties. We had lots of classrooms. Our idea was people learn music very differently. No two people learn music in the same way. So the best we can do is create a space, a safe space, for people to come and learn about different kinds of music and let them find their own ways, navigate their path to discover what will make sense for them at any point in time. So we would have about 30 to 50 music classes from all over the world at any point in time. And students would come in and would just start exploring what's happening in the school. And amazing things have happened. We've had bands that are still performing that came out of these classrooms. We've had people get married. And we had lots of parties. Then on January 25th, 2011, the biggest Zambaleta I've ever seen happened in my hometown where I used to go to school, right in Tahrir Square. So I was curious. I wanted to participate in this one. So I closed the music school in San Francisco, and I went back to Cairo to be part of this new experimental music party that we had. I spent the whole summer there trying to figure out what's happening. I knew it was not going to last long, but I kind of wanted to be there. And then when the summer ended, I went back to San Francisco, and I was asking myself, so what am I going to do now? Am I going to start the music school again? Am I going to go back to Egypt? And that's when my friend, another ethnomusicologist, Japanese accordion player, who teaches at Boston University, invited me to watch her perform with an Ethiopian funk band in Oakland, California. And I was totally blown away. I saw this music, and I asked myself, one, how come have I never seen this music before? Ethiopians are on the same river as Egyptians, yet growing up in Egypt, I've never been exposed to Ethiopian music or culture. And even in San Francisco, it's pretty rare to find a treat like that. So it got me thinking, what am I doing trying to be part of this new thing that's happening in Egypt, trying to find a skill that I have that can be relevant to what's going on over there. And that's when I started talking to a friend of mine. Her name is Maklit Hadero. She's a singer. Some of you know her. About starting a project together. And it was a musical project that would bring together musicians from all of the countries of the Nile Basin to come up with music that allows all the different audiences in those 11 countries to start seeing themselves as part of this ecosystem, as part of one community, one region. Especially that at that time, this was 2011, Ethiopia was starting to build the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that you see here. And we saw this musical project to have a really important role in exposing these people to one another, to start the conversation on a tone that is more about being part of the same ecosystem rather than you're taking our water, we need to start debating, having a geopolitical argument about whose water it is, which was something that we saw could be coming up. So that's Maklit and I when we first started the project. I need to give you a little bit of background about the Nile because most of us don't know much about the Nile. I couldn't list 3 of those countries when I first started the project, and I'm from Egypt. So the Nile is the longest river in the world. You probably know that. It flows north. So there are 2 Niles, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. And the White Nile flows from Lake Victoria into Uganda, into South Sudan, and it meets the Blue Nile that's coming from Ethiopia in Khartoum in Sudan. And then they flow into the Mediterranean. And it runs from tropical climate, where there's a lot of rain most of the year, to some of the water scarcest areas in the world, which is Sudan and Egypt. Total desert, most of their water is coming from the Nile. So there's a really interesting issue going on with this particular water conflict is the fact that the countries that are most powerful, the countries in the north, specifically Egypt, that is controlling all the water resources, are also the countries that are most vulnerable. They are the countries that need the water the most. So it creates a type of conflict that really encourages a cooperative solution. If Ethiopia dams the Nile, the Egyptians are going to get pissed off. They're going to get into a war, so Ethiopia doesn't want to get into a war. And the Egyptians cannot control the water resources for 11 countries. So we knew there was a lot of room for this kind of cooperation. But the history of the Nile Basin and what has happened there was not really on our side. And we could see that we were heading straight into a pretty lethal conflict if nothing was going to be done about it. So we started the project, and what we saw that was needed to change the paradigm, to change the situation. Basically, these 11 countries had been negotiating for the last 20 years to come up with a treaty, and they could not reach an agreement. And for us, what was wrong is that there were some fundamentals to turning this conflict from the status quo to an opportunity for cooperation. What was needed were a few things, were a few fundamentals. We needed a new paradigm that nobody was operating on anybody else's terms. So it wasn't going to be what Egypt wants. It wasn't going to be what Ethiopia wants. It wasn't going to be what Uganda wants. It had to be something that they all agreed on. We needed inspiration. People needed to be inspired to even look at the Nile as a region. Most people in the Nile Basin don't think of themselves as Nile people. So we needed a form of Nile citizenship that allows people to be not just proud of like, oh, here's the river that runs next to my house, but that I share something with these other people that share the same water. So there was also a level of empathy that came with that. People in Egypt had no clue what was going on. They didn't even know the other countries in the Nile Basin. So was the case with most of the other countries. So this cultural exposure that we created would allow people to start becoming more culturally aware of who else was on this other side. And there was a lack of understanding about the fundamentals about the river. Like, what are all these complex problems that we're talking about? Would the dam really limit the amount of water that is coming to Egypt? Are we talking about a water problem or an energy problem or a food problem? So we really needed to kind of create a space that allows everyone to start grasping the complexity, the multidisciplinary complexity of this problem. And we needed creative solutions. So we needed people, once they figure out what are these problems, to start seeing what their role is in coming up with solutions to these problems. So the way we thought things hadn't happened was that we always talked about the water first. And the water triggered a survival instinct in people and got people to start behaving more like, you know, this is my water, these are my people. And the identity politics degenerated into a geopolitical argument that never really led to a constructive, open-minded, interesting way of problem solving. So we thought the first conversation had to be not about water, it had to be about something else. And for us, this was the heart conversation. It was more about giving people an inspiration that allows them to start empathizing with one another without getting into the geopolitical argument that is about the water. And from there, once we're armed with a political goodwill, a sense of trust that would allow us to have the tough conversations, that's when we would get into the head. That's when we would get into talking about the specifics, about the understanding, about the education. And from there, once people understood what were the problems, we would get into the hands. So what can I do about it? What can you do about it? I personally believe now, after 3 years of doing this, that most people in the world don't see how they are relevant to their water reality. What can they do to benefit their watershed? And I didn't know that myself, and I got to it in a mistakenly way. Like was kind of by chance that I discovered how I'm connected to this Nile and what I can do about it. But I'm seeing that the more people get into their watersheds, get involved in their watersheds, the more they start realizing how their skills fit into this whole process. So for us, it was more about creating a space that allows people to become curious and to become engaged in their watershed. So our models started following this process of first inspiring people, then getting into the learning about the complexities, and then getting into the action piece. So this is how we started the project. We brought together musicians from the Nile Basin, and these musicians collaborated to create music together. And this music was really modeled after the way that we see this ecosystem being sustainable. So it was music that was not made on anybody's terms. It was music that really kind of was a true collaboration among all the musicians in the Nile Basin. And from that music, we would have the workshops at the universities that would really get people to start asking questions and answering their questions, to start grasping the difficult realities around what's happening in the Nile. And from there, different people would start seeing how they can really apply this learning and apply that inspiration in a way that would be relevant to them. For the musicians, this was creating music. For university students that wanted to participate in the project, it was either to start building this Nile movement, or for creative people and innovators to participate in this Nile Prize. So in 2013, in January 2013, we brought together 18 musicians from 7 countries in the Nile Basin. And for 2 weeks, they created this music together. And this was our first album. And we really saw the potential of this project and how deep it hit people in Egypt when we performed there, that encouraged us to really proceed with the project and to start touring the other Nile countries. So in January 2014, we had our first Africa tour, and we performed in 5 of the Nile Basin countries. This coming year, we're going to be performing in the United States, so we're doing a tour for 4 months in the US, starting in January. And we're also launching the Nile Fellowship for student leaders in 5 universities in the Nile Basin to start building this Nile movement. So this is not really about the Nile Project. It's more about the case study that somebody that had nothing to do with the Nile Basin, that through this revolution discovered how their relationship to their watershed can be actualized in a way that makes sense for them and makes sense for the people that they live with. And I hope this is something that you can take home and think about your own Nile project. Thank you very much.